Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am privileged to be asked to share my thoughts on the extraordinary theme of global humanitarian assistance. I must confess at the start that I'm no expert in this area. And indeed, I'm in awe of the distinguished guests and panelists who will discuss this theme, I hope vigorously, today. So my comments today are as a novice, but a keen follower of this topic. And I hope you'll excuse me if I take a somewhat different lens to this and act as an agent provocateur to the distinguished panel of speakers who will discuss this in more length. Let me start by acknowledging that all of us are still living through one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our times, COVID-19, where countless lives and livelihoods have been severely affected. The pandemic comes in the context of a worsening climate crisis and rising economic inequality. And while the world has responded with varying degrees of humanitarian assistance in this crisis, I do believe that humanitarian assistance alone is not enough. History shows us that in times of disruption, resilience depends on adaptability and creating sustainable systems. Once the most acute period of the pandemic subsides, a resilient agenda will become critical to future prosperity. And that, friends, is what I will focus on in today's talk. But one of the questions before I start, people do ask is, what is the difference between humanitarian assistance and development assistance? Let me provide a simple definition. The primary objective of humanitarian assistance is to save lives, alleviate suffering, and maintain human dignity. And it's often triggered by short-term emergencies, like a war or a COVID or a pandemic or something which is unexpected, near term, it happens, and all efforts go in effectively in resolving that crisis. Whereas development aid is much more meant for longer term sustainable improvement of endemic issues that society faces. But I think one of the things that I will argue is that perhaps this is a false distinction. If you look at most of the crises today, they are no longer just immediate short-term crisis. They are long-term issues. We are already in our third year of COVID. Climate change is going to be with us for more than a decade. Wars are perennial. Geopolitics remains uncertain at some level. So I would argue that the way we have to think about it is much more jointed, but more on that a little bit later. Let me start by defining the magnitude of the problem. Humanitarian assistance, I think, is something which today affects nearly 300 million people from around the world. And many people would argue that, this is something which is understated, because by and large, the nature of this problem affects far, far more many people. Some would say it's even as close to 500 million people who are in need of some kind of humanitarian assistance. Take, for example, even the US post-COVID-19, where more than 50 million people went hungry for prolonged periods of time. So people are, of course, for a variety of reasons, not very comfortable disclosing such large numbers, but that in some sense gives you a sense of the magnitude. And one of the authorities whose numbers I rely on, which is the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, estimates that number to be more like the 250 million range with nearly 75 countries. Suffice to say that it is a very large number. And the fact really is that this number is only going to get worse. If you look at the impact of just one factor alone, climate change and the floods and the droughts that it will cause, and the numbers of people who will be forced to migrate. Again, people estimate that number to be in the 80 to 100 million range, which will be double of the migration population today. We are really looking at something which is quite extraordinary. And the nature of the human assistance will only increase as opposed to going down. So how have we in the world dealt with it so far? All of us have seen and observed, many governments, multilateral agencies, NGOs, etc., doing yeoman work. And if you look at over the last 2-3 decades, I think it would be remiss not to really praise the work that they have done And it is clear that had they not done the work that they had, the world would be in a far more disastrous place than it is today. But the unfortunate truth is that many of these institutions are massively overstretched and overwhelmed. It's not just funding alone. So if you look at funding, the donors, whether it's the ODA, whether if we look at philanthropic donors, whether we look at governments, I think people have been quite generous, and we've seen that grown at about 5 to 7% per annum. In fact, private philanthropic donations have grown by 25% year on year over the last 5 years to hit about a total number of about $30 billion in total of aid which goes into humanitarian assistance. But that's meeting just about 60% of the needs. So there is still a huge gap. There's close to 40 to 15% gap in terms of what the funding requirement is. And it's true that in the last 2 years, the amount of money coming in has actually plateaued. So this is a problem, but it is not the only problem. And we'll come back to this funding issue in a bit. There are two other problems which I think are even more acute. I think the first is assistance getting to people in a timely manner? And people who need it, are they getting the aid that they want? It's quite revealing. And in fact, there was a recent speech by the Undersecretary General of Humanitarian Affairs at the UN, Mark Lowlock, who said that despite all of our good intentions, the humanitarian system actually is set up to give people in need what international agencies and donors want them to have, as opposed to what they need and what they want to have. And he cites many visits that he has made in his official capacity to, say, Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, to Chad, to many countries in Africa, Iran, Sri Lanka, and has consistently found that less than 15% of the aid that goes in actually is what people want. And in many cases, people actually sell what they get as aid to actually buy things that they really need. This is a real problem. And I've often thought myself, having spent 3 decades in the corporate world, how would my company or how would any company survive if they were producing things that their customers didn't want? This is something we really have to reflect on. And why is there such horrendous apathy to their customers? So that's even as important a problem as the funding problem. The other thing which clearly is a problem is accountability. And it's very clear that there is both dispersed and lack of clear accountability. No one can complain. Customers don't complain. In this case, the receivers of aid have no voice. So it's never clear whether there is an accountability in terms of timeliness, accountability in terms of is it actually achieving the objectives, and measures are fairly antiquated in terms of the money that is going in and the return on investment of that money which is really being made. And finally, I think there is a massive lack of collaboration or coordination between international agencies, local NGOs on the ground, development agencies versus humanitarian agencies. There are a number of players who are all well-intentioned, without a doubt, but highly uncoordinated, and in the end, we don't get the kind of impact that we really deserve in terms of the money going into the hands of people who truly need it. So that's a little bit the status and the situation. So what do we do about it? And I thought I would end with about 4 or 5 ideas for consideration. And the first idea is really around this notion of moving seamlessly between humanitarian and development aid. We know that very often there is an immediate response to the crisis which will stem the crisis. But unless we are able to follow that up by funding which will create sustainable mechanisms, we are unlikely to see that crisis not recur again and again and again. So making sure that development aid quickly follows humanitarian aid, and in fact, I would argue is tightly synced, is the first idea which we should explore and remove this artificial distinction. The second thing I would suggest is a much closer linkage between the people who actually get the aid and the providers of that aid, whether it be the NGO and the international agencies, and to work much more closely on the ground in an agile manner, making sure we are getting feedback on the ground, making sure they're making the adaptations and adjustments and getting the right kind of aid, whether it be cash, and many would argue that cash is probably the best, but kind where relevant, to the right hands in a timely manner, and doing this in a much speedier and much more adaptive method. That's a second suggestion. And the third is around localization. Goes to say that, look, it is very easy sitting somewhere far away to spend a lot of money and hope that things happen. But in reality, it is the people on the ground who are actually making things happen. So how do we ensure greater localization in terms of decisions, in terms of the programs of humanitarian assistance? I think that's a third element which I would highlight. And finally, I would say that on funding itself, I think there is need for much greater innovation, much greater products even than the traditional funding route. So thinking about insurance, for example, as a way of funding, looking at different sources of funding like high net worth individuals, etc. Those would be the other elements to also look at. Again, my thesis as I would end this session would be to say that let's use this to reimagine humanitarian assistance. Let's not keep this distinction between humanitarian assistance and development assistance. Let's really bring the different folks together and let's really make a substantive and material change. We are looking at a world which is far more complex and far more volatile and far more crisis prone in the years to come, and getting ready now is in all of our interest. Thank you.